Okay then, this is social influence and this is minority influence. And this differs from the previous section because we've been looking at, if you think about conformity, another way of, another name for that is majority influence, because in conformity what you have is a majority influencing the people who are in the minority. So like in Ash's experiment, six other Confederates influencing the one participant who is on their own. So we're now looking at how minorities can influence the majority. So when you've got one person that's giving a different view, and they slowly, it's a different kind of process, but they can bring other people round to their own viewpoint. So it's kind of like the opposite of conformity. It's very interesting. Now, what this means is one person or a small group of people influences the beliefs and behaviours of other people. That's the technical definition of it. And what normally happens is that it leads to internalization. So if you think about, if I go back to our picture here, if you think about conformity, in the kind of situation where you've got the majority influencing the minority, that can often lead to compliance. We talked about this earlier in term, where it's just a temporary change and they only conform publicly rather than privately. With minority influence, it tends to be the other way round, because the person in the minority, for the others to change, they really have to win them round to their point of view. There's not that same kind of pressure, so it tends to lead to internalization, where it's a proper conversion, like a permanent change that's both public and private, when a minority influences someone else. So we're going to look at the processes involved, and there's three processes that we're going to look at. The first is consistency, which means remaining the same. So there's two types within this. Synchronic consistency is where the group, all the people in the minority group all say the same thing as each other. So they all say the same thing. So they're consistent within that group. Because a minority, although my picture is one person, it doesn't have to be just one person. It might be a small group that's in the minority. The other kind of consistency is called diachronic consistency. And this is where all the members of the minority have been saying the same thing over time. So the idea is, okay, if they're still saying the same thing after all this time, then maybe there's something to it. So there's the two sides to that consistency. And that's probably one of the most important factors, or at least it's the one that we've got the most research about, which we'll talk about in a minute. The second factor that we look at is commitment, and that is where the members of the minority group engage in extreme risky activities to show commitment. And this might be even as far as dying for the cause that they're putting forward. For example, if you think about we'll do more of this when we do social change, but the suffragettes went through a lot, and you'll be reading about this, but things like going into prison and being force-fed, and then Emily Wilding Davis throwing herself in front of the king's horse and dying. So those kinds of things, it doesn't have to be that extreme. That's an extreme example, but what it does is it shows people that they how much they believe in what they're trying to put forward, whatever their cause is. In this case, the vote for women, like they think it's so important that they're prepared to die for it, and that lends a lot of weight to their argument, and people then take more notice. It might be something like where animal rights protesters do a march where they parade naked or something like that. So it doesn't have to be like putting your life in danger, but something reasonably extreme to show real commitment and get people to take notice. Then the third process that's involved is flexibility. So if people just repeat the same arguments again and again and again, then that they tend to be seen as like narrow-minded and rigid and a bit dogmatic. Whereas if they are prepared to accept reasonable counter-arguments and kind of adapt their point of view a little bit, and they're not completely rigid, then that often wins other people round to their point of view. So all of those three processes are involved in this, and we'll look at some examples of that now that we're looking at the research. So the first study that we've got about this is by someone called Moscovici, and he was looking particularly at consistency. So he's investigating how consistency affects minority influence. And what he had is a series of blue slides that looked not like all of these on one slide, but he'd show one of these colours on one slide, probably not some of the ones that look a little bit less blue. They were all definitely blue, so ignore the purple ones. This is just a random picture I've got off the internet. So they were definitely blue slides, but different shades of blue, and they were told they had to judge the colour, and they were in a group. Most of them were in a group where there were 2 Confederates and 4 participants, and they had 2 experimental conditions. The first one was called the consistent condition, and in this case the 2 Confederates in the group who were in the minority, they always called the slide green instead of blue. And in the other experimental condition, which was called the inconsistent one, about 2/3 of the time the Confederates called the slide green. So it's varying how much. So this time in the first condition they're consistently calling it green. In the second condition they're calling it green most of the time, but not all of the time. And then in the control condition, it was all participants. There were no Confederates, and they all ended up calling it blue all of the time. So what we want to do is compare these 2 conditions for results, and hopefully, if it's going to support his hypothesis, then we're going to find that this consistent condition is more likely to produce some kind of change of opinion in the participants, because the Confederates are being consistent with the fact that it's green. Okay, so here's our findings, and the consistent minority influenced the participant on 8% of the slides. So that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you remember that these slides were clearly blue, the key thing also is comparing it to our control and inconsistent conditions, and you'll see in your textbook there's a little, in the textbook copy that I've given you, there's a little graph, a bar chart. You can see that there is a really significant difference between the consistent and the inconsistent. I think the inconsistent was something like 1%, and it was even less than that for the control. They were both basically no effect, whereas the consistent minority did have some effect, not massive effect, only 8%, but comparing it to the inconsistent and control, it's fairly significant. What he then did after he'd found those results was he gave them actually a private task. So they had some discs. There were about 10 I think. A number of them were definitely green, a number of them were definitely blue, and then most of them in the middle were kind of ambiguous, so they were there was some kind of bluey green, and they had to sort them into blue and green. And those who had been in the consistent condition, where the Confederates had called all the slides green, they were more likely to say that the discs were green. So they would sort more of these middle kind of turquoisey discs into the green pile, which suggests, or what Moscovici concluded, was that internalization had taken place. So they'd been in this condition where the Confederates had called the slides green, and that had been influencing them, first of all during the experiment with the slides, and then in this experiment afterwards, when the Confederates aren't even listening and they're not present, it's a private task, they're still being influenced by them. So that suggests that it's more than just a really temporary change, which is why we're suggesting that internalization has taken place. Okay. Now, moving to evaluation, obviously you could use Moscovici's evaluation of the whole area of minority influence, because what it does is it actually supports the idea of, if we're looking at these 3 processes, it supports the idea of commitment. Sorry, not of commitment, of consistency. And if we carry on, we've got a further variation of the study where they gave all their answers privately to the slide task, where they're being shown the slides of blue slides, and they found in that case that there was more conformity, which they explain that by saying that what we've got in that particular case is in the first experiment, they maybe agreed with the Confederates, with the minority, but they didn't like to agree out loud because they're embarrassed to do so, or something. Maybe they see the minority as being a bit weird, or they don't really want to identify with them or show that they're caving in or something. So when they give their answers privately, we find a higher conformity rate, which again supports the fact that probably they agree with them. And then the main problem, which I'm sure you've spotted with this experiment, is the artificiality of the task. If we're talking about changing someone's views on animal rights or something, how much you can apply from this lab experiment where they're being shown slides of blue, you could question that, certainly, because it is very artificial. However, we've got other research that does support it as well. We've got a meta-analysis of lots of studies, about 100 studies, I think, by a guy called Wood, and he found, again, across all of those studies, that minorities which were consistent were the most influential. So again, that supports the whole idea of consistency being one of the processes that helps minorities to win people over. And then we've got research support for the idea of flexibility as well. So we've got two good studies there that support the idea of consistency, and then we've got one study for flexibility, which I'll outline on the next slide, which is a jury situation, and then the last point is that the real problem, extrapolating, generalizing from research to the real world. So in this particular case, it's not just about measuring how many people are in the minority, which the research tends to focus on, like how big does a minority need to be maybe to sway the majority or this sort of thing. Actually, in the real world, it can be quite a bit more complex than that. Like if your people who are in the minority are people with a lot of power or status or things like that, or the way that the minority is perceived. So you've got a lot more factors in the real world. So that's a real problem, generalizing from experiments to the real world. Right, let's just look at this Nemeth and Brillmeyer study. And what they did was they had a group of a jury, a simulated jury, and they had to decide on the amount of compensation paid to someone in a ski lift accident. And they put a Confederate in there, and in the first place, in one of the conditions, the Confederates stuck rigidly to their alternative point of view, right from the start all the way through, and that actually had no effect on any of the rest of the jury. If they made their Confederate compromise and show some degree of shift, then that did influence other people. So not to stick rigidly to their point of view, but to, as we said before, accept counter-arguments and be able to adapt a little bit. That had an influence, but only if they did it late on in the process. So if they did it early in the process, it was seen like they were just caving in to everyone else's point of view. But if they did it late on in the process, actually they then were quite influential. So those are our evaluation points. That is minority influence.